One of the great underlying myths of the past years is that the Chinese economic miracle, and it was a miracle, is eternal. I see China weakening, becoming a less of a force, and the People's Liberation Army is an internal security force. It's not going to attack anyone. This China is not part of China. These factories don't sell in China. You can't sell those products to people who are at a subsistence level agricultural life. These are extensions of the West. These factories are part of the American economy, the Australian economy, the European economy, but mostly the American economy. And if the American economy stops buying because we have a recession or we increase our savings rate, then what happens is that the rate of growth of exports falls and their ability to cover their debts fall. And what you're seeing in China right now is the government scrambling badly to use what are actually quite limited reserves. $2 trillion isn't what it used to be. To simultaneously try to get demand going in the interior of China, which you can't do with about $600 billion. That's just not enough for 1.1 trillion people. And secondly, to cover the banks that are in very deep trouble because of cash flow issues. And thirdly, make sure they're putting enough into the American economy so the American economy doesn't slip any deeper into recession and stop buying GI Joes from China and everything else that they sell. And so I would argue that China has a double whammy on it. It has reached a stage that Japan and Southeast and Eastern Asia reached at a certain point. And it reached at about 10 years cycle. So there was Japan hit, East Asia hit, China's hitting now. The Japanese collapse came from an American recession in 91, 92, because they were exporting to us and we stopped buying. Very similar phenomenon occurred in the 1990s, although it was somewhat more complex, having not to do with the United States. But this recession is not particularly hurting the United States. It's clobbering the Chinese. If this hadn't happened, they still would have had their non-performing loan problem, the very low rate of return on capital problem, and the fact that 1.1 billion Chinese are furious at being left out and of having their land stolen. Because one of the ways that you get loans in China is through land. And when a company needs more loans, it needs more land, and the company official goes to his cousin, who is the assistant governor of the region, and they take land. And if you read the newspapers, you will read about land riots and so on going on in China. This isn't happening just because mean people are doing things. This is how you're stabilizing the banking system. When you ask the question, if China is doing so well, why are they so obsessed with security? Why are they violating human rights? Why are they doing all these things? Two answers are possible. They're incredibly wicked people who don't appreciate the fact that they could live like Australians if they just stopped it, or the Chinese know a great deal more about China than Westerners, and they know they're in trouble, which is a very long way of saying, but it was a very important question, because one of the great underlying myths of the past years is that the Chinese economic miracle, and it was a miracle, is eternal, and that it can go on ad infinitum and will go on ad infinitum. And what I've tried to lay out is the reasons, the single most important question of why it's not going on, and it certainly can't go on for another 30 years. China has a population of 1.3 billion people. 1.1 billion of these people live at a standard of living of Nigeria. I went to Pudong and had one of those wonderful dinners that costs your next year's earnings. And I asked, what one of the waitresses was making. And she was making $60, $70 a month. And I went to the place she lived. She was living in a concrete building, unheated. There was cold water, no hot water, and the privies were outside for reasons I don't understand. And she regarded this as a marvelous improvement over what she had before in the farms. So 1.1 billion of this people live in the most extraordinary poverty. The characteristics of Asian economies are fairly similar. They are based on not having a market economy in capital. Capital is distributed for political reasons, for social reasons, for kairetsu reasons, what have you. Japan in 1990 had, in the industrial world, the lowest rate of return on capital in the world, which means they sold a lot of products, they didn't make a lot of money. My Uncle Louis had a dress business. He sold dresses for $9. It cost him $10 to make it, but he figured he'd make it up in volume. In many cases, in Asian economies, you have very narrow profit margins, and the rate of growth does not reflect the health of the economy. In fact, as in the case of Uncle Louis, a very good Christmas killed him. And you really have to take that very seriously, because we tend to focus on growth rates because some of the disciplines of non-Asian economies will mean that a high growth rate will mean profit, that there is a connection between the two. And one of the things we learned in Japan is there wasn't. They had an extraordinarily high growth rate. It hollowed out their banking system, leading to the crisis of 1991 and froze up the country. China has that problem, and I'll define it in these terms. When Japan went south, as we say in the States, the ratio of non-performing loans, in other words, loans that you're going to stiff the bank on, to GDP was 17%. When Korea and Taiwan ran into trouble, they were at about 23%. If you believe Chinese official government figures, the number in China of non-performing loans to GDP is about 40%. And that's an optimistic number. So this is an economy that has reached the climax stage that's built into the kind of capital allocation you do in Asia. One of the characteristics of reaching this stage is everybody is gaga over you because you are selling more and more and growing faster and faster. Well, of course, you have a debt-driven economy. You're trying to cover your cash flow. So you sell. You sell for cash flow, not for profitability. And every month you're going to grow. And every month everybody's going to say, marvelous, what a great country. We knew that Japan was in deep trouble when the Japanese started investing in Pebble Beach and Rockefeller centered everything not in Japan. And we asked a very stupid question. If Japan is such a wonderful investment that anybody be a fool not to invest in, why are the Japanese not investing there? Why are they buying anything outside of Japan? And there was a reason, which is that the insiders knew. They knew the problems they had. In 95, 96, you had a similar massive outflow of capital from Taiwan and South Korea. And again, the media took this to be a sign of enormous strength, whereas it was really a harbinger of terrific problems. You now have a massive outflow of capital from China, buying mines, buying condos, buying anything that's not in China, which, if the prognostications from China enthusiasts in the West were true, would be suicidally stupid behavior. Why do I want to own real estate in Australia when I can be in an economy that's going to grow by 15% forever? Well, the answer is growth and profitability are two different things, and they know better.